Hello, sociologists. Welcome to class. Today we're going to talk about racial formation theory. So in 1986, two guys named Michael Omi and Howard Winott wrote a book called Racial Formation in the United States. Their book brings us the theory of racial formation. While this theory didn't immediately take off within academic circles, it has since then become understood as foundational or a foundational theory regarding race within academia. So, what's racial formation? Well, racial formation is defined by essentially by Omi and Winant as the socio-historical process by which racial identities are created, lived out, transformed, and destroyed. It's the making and remaking of racial categories in which racial categories are always being embedded with meaning and redefined over time and across cultures. What does that mean? It means that race is essentially a social construction. And racial formation tells us that we're constantly creating and recreating and embedding with meaning our ideas or our concepts of what it means to be a particular race. Now, how does this occur? So we know that it's not the everyday citizen who creates racial categories. It's essentially those with power. A good example of an institutional power that can create racial categories is the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget. You probably know the Office of Management and Budget, or the OMB, as the census. They're the people who do the census. And they are largely responsible for creating and recreating the categories that we know as race and or ethnicity. They actually have two separate definitions. Race is largely defined as how people perceive your racial category to be, or what group in which you belong in, based on your exterior appearance. Ethnicity is often self identified and includes your language and your culture. So, for example, in 1976, there were five racial classifications: American Indian and Alaska Native, Asian and Pacific Islanders, non Hispanic blacks, non Hispanic whites, and Hispanics of any race. You could not choose more than one, you only chose one. But in 1997, we got the OMB issued a revised standard and a new set of categories with new instructions. This was because of like political grassroots movements where people said they wanted new instructions and new categories, and that's one of the reasons why the OMB changed it. They can choose not to, they do. But the new categories are white, black, American Indian and Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islanders. They left out people of Persian descent who were actively trying to create their or get their own category in the OMB, and they made Hispanics regarded as a ethnic group, not no longer their own separate race. They also did something very important. They allowed multiple entries. And you notice how this affects our understanding of race today, because if you talk to somebody who was born after 1997, they will often tell you that they are multiple racial categories. They will say two or three, right? Whereas if you talk to your grandparents, probably people who were born before the 1990s or before the 1980s, they will often only give you one racial category. And this is because while the OMB isn't telling us how to define our race, categories from government bureaucracies and social structures often help to embed meaning into race and shape our consciousness and our understanding of race. Most recently, something that occurred because of also another kind of grassroots and political movement was that we are again trying to redefine Hispanics as their own racial category. And this is due to what we call racial projects. And racial projects, we'll talk about in just a minute what those are. But the federal government did decide not to add this new category as a racial category, but the debate still continues. So we may see in the near future, in 2024 or 2028, that Hispanics are again going to be added as a racial category as opposed to an ethnic category. So the government has the ability to reinforce racial inequality or alleviate racial inequality. So what are some of the ways in which our government has historically reinforced racial inequality? The legitimate and legal policies and laws of slavery, redlining and racialized residential segregation, educational segregation, disparate policing and disparate incarceration based on race lines, unequal health care based on race, or unequal access to health care based on race, structural systemic racism that's built into our laws and policies like Jim Crow laws, and things like currently going on like redistricting laws that redistribute voting power along racial lines. These are all ways in which our government and people with power can reinforce inequality based on race. What are some of the ways in which we have historically seen them alleviate racial inequality? That is things like affirmative action laws and policies, the Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional to segregate children based on race. We have seen, though, and we are currently seeing debate in the political sphere, especially you see a lot of negative projects against affirmative action. We're trying to eliminate the Board of Education and all funding for the Board of Education, which will dramatically increase inequality among the classes. Some of the policies that could alleviate inequality that we're currently fighting against within our culture and our political sphere are things like investment in education, increasing the minimum wage, expanding the earned income tax credit, in attempts for policies and laws that build assets for working class families. All of these things reduce inequality and also therefore reduce economic inequality. Well, how does this happen? This happens through what we call racial projects. So racial projects is any effort to organize and distribute or redistribute resources along particular racial lines or across racial lines, right? So whenever legislators pass, for example, redistricting laws that redistribute voting power along racial lines, this is what we would call a racial project. It isn't inherently racist, or isn't necessarily what you might call bad, right? A racist racialized project, for example, we've seen both of these recently with voting rights. If they're trying to redistrict laws that limit the voting power of any subordinate racial group and exacerbate racial inequality, meaning give more power to a particular racial group that already has unequal power, that would be what we would call a racist racial project. But when a racial project is trying to redistrict laws distributing racial voting power more fairly across racial lines, so to make it more equal across the board, that is just a racial project. It is not inherently racist just because they're trying to create equal access to the resource of voting or to the power of voting. So I believe that is it. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have a little bit better understanding of racial formation.